going of all of that, if somebody is looking at having psychedelics for like microdosing for medical use to improve their life, am I right understanding there's not necessarily a guarantee which way it's going to go?
There's some great research. Vince Polito in Australia has been doing some of the best research on microdosing. So my first recommendation would be seek out his research. And there's a really good book. What's the mushroom first time trip? What's the mushroom book? Okay, I'll come back to it. There's one with a chapter on Vince that's all about the first time mushroom book. I'll think of it.
Maybe the blue type.
Have a Good Trip.
Oh yeah.
Have a Good Trip by Eugenia Bone.
It's got a really good chapter on microdosing. I'm sure people will throw things at me by saying this, but the scientific evidence is very much still out there around microdosing.
Mate, I was on the ship back in the 70s, man.
On a personal level, that's fantastic.
Run my own.
But I'll
Picking
pass
them.
this across and start with Liam.
So I think what kind of Ronnie's getting at there is microdosing is a pretty new concept and hasn't really been involved in any kind of advanced situations where microdoses are given to humans and then some kind of outcome is measured. So Vince, this guy we're talking about, I'm not sure if it's happened yet, but he's at least got very close to doing some kind of randomized, I'm probably going to describe this wrong, but some interesting randomized study where people self-dose, and this gets around some of the tricky legal stuff of doing the study, but they also self-blind. And so the aim is to compare, microdosing versus not microdosing and how obvious it is. Because I think the concept of microdosing has become popular for a few different reasons, but the concept, as I understand it, is to have enough. The idea of microdosing is there's not enough to produce an effect. And if that's the case, how do you know that you've had that? So in reality, what I think people are actually doing are more like mini dosing, where they're, or maybe what I would prefer to call functional dosing, where they're having enough to still be able to operate, but they do notice that there's some effects. And in terms of the advantage of psychedelics in general, it's not well studied, let alone this kind of new conceptual approach to doing it, which I think is largely around people still just being want to do stuff, as well as maybe some stigma and fear around macrodosing, like, sometimes the idea of tripping can invoke anxiety, which can then be magnified in the trip. So taking a smaller dose, and this very concept I think is a way we've kind of developed to help deal with that. Do the benefits occur in the same extent? I think there's limited evidence that suggests there's some correlation between like some kind of dosage, quantity and overall therapeutic outcomes. But I would still say, for the most part, we're all just guinea pigs, like doing stuff randomly to ourselves and being like, seems good. And like, yeah, like I think it probably is good, but it's super basic level in terms of how advanced we are around cannabis, for example. Like we've done way more instances of giving it to people in a controlled way, measuring what happens. Psychedelics, we haven't done it barely yet because it's so much red tape just to be like, give this guy like a mushroom is like a big deal.
Microdosing is a fairly broad concept as well. I mean, it's generally considered it's below the threshold of perception, so you're not going to perceive any kind of psychedelic experience. But essentially, yeah, there's been no double-blind studies on it. So a lot of the studies that we do have on it are just small runs of people who've been doing it and then reporting back on their experiences. I know Stamets kind of had a public thing that he was running as well, and there was a lot of data that came out of that. But microdosing can run across a variety of different substances. So people are microdosing psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, ibogaine. So it's quite a popular concept. But because of it, placebo is also a really, really powerful drug. And there was a paper, I think, that came out during the mid-noughts that demonstrated that placebo has a profound healing effect in its own right. So if you, I don't want to put you off microdosing, but microdosing might be that thing that helps to prompt you to go, oh yeah, I feel better. By feeling better, you're going to feel better. kind of this curious psychological thing that we do. But there has been some studies to show that, for example, psilocybin, I think there's something that came out this year to show that it is functionally helping grow new neural connections. The same with lion's mane has been shown to promote the development of neural connections as well. So some of these things do seem to be functional. There's perhaps sort of individual factors to be considered as well.
I think that placebo is really a key thing here. But also, another thing that was discovered way back in the late 50s and 60s is that you've got this continuum of humans, and for the vast majority of them, this much psychedelics has this result. But there's a few people up this end that you can just give fucking 10 times that amount before they even feel it. And there's a handful at this end that you can give a tiny, tiny amount and they'll start spinning out, right? So you kind of have to be aware of that. Doesn't seem to be part of the current literature, but that was something that was discovered back in the early 60s when it was still legal. As someone who did a lot of microdosing back in the 90s when I had a big stash of acid, which is like the thing to do, what I personally, I've got no scientific basis for this, so it could be just completely subjective. I think what it might help to do is rearrange the brain chemistry a little bit, in the same way that MDMA leaves you feeling incredibly depleted the Tuesday after you've had your Saturday night dose. A psychedelic, a tryptamine, DMT, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, that's something else, but all of them, kind of the next day, as long as you've got a good night's sleep, you actually feel a lot better and a lot more happy. So it might be serotonin, which is probably a discredited brain chemical at this point in history. I don't know, I'm not a chemist or an academic, but I do think that that's where the microdosing might be good, and that it actually gives people a little bit more of the brain chemistry that makes them, that does get rid of depression. But there's no scientific studies being done on that. Any of these guys will tell you, no one really knows. And most people, you can take what prescribed microdose is and you won't even feel it. But it could make you feel better after a few days.
Alright, shall we go to the next question? Here we go.
Thank you. Just wondering if you'd be going back to the first question a little bit, like with bad trips, do you think that there's a possibility that it could be like an allergic reaction, like an actual allergy to the plant or anything, or is that just...
Who would like to take that one on?
Certainly with mushrooms. Some people do have a gut reaction to the chitin that's present within mushrooms. That can set off anxiety, it can set off the beginnings of what could be a bad trip. There are certain ways around that. I know a lot of people do like lemon taking to try to get around that nausea feeling, or even just doing like a tea. Try to get rid of as much of that material as possible. In terms of other plants, I'm not quite sure. I'll leave that for other people to comment on.
Next question on the back there.
My question's about research on long-term effect of using psychedelics and over a long period of time. You know, like a few of the older states people in here, I've started taking LSD in the late 60s and yeah, on and off since then. A little while ago I mapped out a chart with all about 100 friends that I had in the 60s and 70s to see where their lives had gone, whether they were still alive and all that sort of stuff. And it seemed to me that the people who had done best or had led the most stable life were those people who had used quite a bit of psychedelics in their teens, late teens, early 20s, and then used occasionally after that. Now it's terribly subjective, but it's, and you know, of course 25% of them died in the 70s from heroin addiction, from heroin overdoses. But after that, it seemed to me that, you know, they were the most kind of, you know, they've led the best lives. And I'm just wondering, is there any research that looks at 50 years of use of psychedelics, and directed to the elder statesman or me or James if that's...
No worries. I mean, there's very inspiring people that are still alive that have dedicated themselves and their life and the community to psychedelics, and yeah, that's a good example. Like Kathleen Harrison, people like that are just amazing. But who wants to take this question?
It's a fantastic question, Robbie, and I'm not aware of any of that research, I have to say. What I am aware of is, like there's a book, Zigzag Zen, big, thick book, fantastic book, on Buddhist practitioners, and a huge number, you know, ranging from Buddhist, Hindu, you know, Ramdas, but a very large number of you know, senior meditation teachers started off, as it were, with psychedelics, and that kind of opened their mind to other levels of consciousness. That is a fantastic book, and I'd really recommend it. It's pretty hard to get. Zigzag Zen, yeah. So there's those kind of anecdotes. Equally, there's a whole bunch of anecdotes of people who've gone on taking psychedelics in larger quantities who don't do so well. But I think it's a fascinating question. I don't know that research. I'm not even sure it's been done. Does anyone else know? Yeah, yeah.
I don't know of any research either, but I imagine that longitudinal research like that would likely need to take into account a lot of other factors, you know, not just you know, isolated psychedelic use, but you know, dietary habits and you know, the ritualized approach to taking the medicines. And you mentioned Kat Harrison, and I know that through my chats with her that she and Terence, over you know a good chunk of their married life, for more than 10 years, had you know undertook a ritualized approach to taking mushrooms, and this is you know, to continue down this train of thought would move away from your question, but I don't know of any research like that. It would be a major undertaking if you're talking about you know, generational changes. You're talking about researchers that would be wanting to pursue that and finding candidates. I suspect you'd have to have candidates who were into self-analysis and reports and keeping sustained logs on their habits, but it would be interesting research.
As everyone says, I really don't think there's been any research done into that, probably because it's illegal, and a lot of people are very cautious about putting their hand up because they'll be tarred as a psychedelic user, God help us, you know. But Alan Watts, who was a wonderfully articulate man, but was the original "don't do as I do as I say" guy, because he drank himself to death, but he had the comment in relation to psychedelics was, once you get the message, hang up the phone. Which is not to say that you can't take another phone call a year later, you know, or, you know, so I do think there's a lot in that. It's good to spend a bit of time in those realms and to suss out where they are, but basically once you've been there, you can get back there just by closing your eyes, actually, and a tiny dose, if you need that, just a tiny dose, and you can get back there, and then, yeah, maybe once a year, maybe once in 10 years, who knows? Yeah, sit down and take, you know, have a look at the books. That's my personal thing, but no research, unfortunately, because as these guys said, I mean, so many people took acid back in the 60s and 70s and went on to great, I mean, God help us, the iPhone was invented by a guy who's on record as saying the most significant thing that ever happened to him was taking acid. You know? And Albert Hoffman, the guy that invented it or discovered acid, lived to 102 or 3 and was wonderfully articulate even then. But he never went hard with it. He always kept a moderate dose and a lot of space in between the doses. It's great to have a big whack to start with and you go, oh my God, that's good, that's a good thing, but maybe it's a bit like getting a deck of cards and shuffling them and throwing them up in the air and then shuffling them, throwing them up in the air. And that's great a few times, but after a while when you pick them up, you notice that some of the corners are a bit bent, you've lost a couple of the cards. You know? So easy does it, maybe.
One thing I will say is that many of the people I regard as my elders, male and female, are frequent psychedelic users. So that's all I can really say, that they've been able to maintain a life of that. And they're some of the people that I look up to the most. Next question. Here we go.
Thank you. Just to change the topic back to what Kane was talking about and discussing before in regards to allergies, especially surrounding psilocybin and psychedelic mushrooms. Is the research that you're doing mapping the genome of certain species helpful in perhaps, and I'm not sure if this is already happening, just as someone that has quite a few dietary restrictions that have come up in the last few years, which includes no fungi, is that something that could help people like myself and other people that have those dietary restrictions experience that particular compound?
That sounds kind of like a breeding thing, like getting an understanding of the levels of chitin production within the mushrooms. I know there are mutations in some psilocybin cubensis cultivars that the tissue is weaker, so they would probably then have like cause less dietary distress when you consume the mushroom. It's something that could come up through genetic analysis but it's a matter of identifying the genetic regions that are responsible for that area. And we're still very, very early days in terms of being able to breed a mushroom that is going to have less of those problems. I would be looking at other preparation methods if that is a particular issue. Okay, yeah. Like I said, lemon tech or making a tea or an extract. Because you need to get rid of just that chitin material. That's what's causing your dietary problems.
Or 4-ACO DMT is a psilocybin prodrug that's like pretty widely available in synthetic form, so that would be easily enough to find online. 4-ACO DMT.
Alright, I think I'll ask a question. What do we think, what is the role of community when it comes to psychedelics?
Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious. I mean, that's a loaded question, isn't it, Robert? A guy who's spent much of his life building community, having community grow around himself, and being just a laid-back figure who doesn't want all the attention at the same time, and should be commended for that. And obviously we're in a place where a community has evolved since, certainly before 1973, but I understand that this town was converted from a dairy town in 1973 with the Aquarius Festival, and we're downstream from that. And I've lived in and around this community on and off, and it's such a remarkable evolution. And there are other figures on this panel who can speak more to that. So obviously, community support in terms of active resistance to prohibition and regulations is essential, and working together and finding the others, and absolutely essential. I could probably talk about this for another hour, but I'm going to hand it on.
A couple of things I'd say. Firstly, one of the sort of key impacts of psychedelics is enhancement of social connection and enhancement of connection to nature. So that's sort of a reliable impact of psychedelics. The other sort of comment I'd make is that what's happening in the States and the UK, but has not happened so much here yet, is the idea of community integration networks. So there are a lot of people clearly out there, including people on the North Coast, who are using psychedelics. So people, coming back to the first question, so people have a variety of experiences, and some of those experiences are not so positive on the face of it, and access to integration services are often, either expensive or difficult. So the idea of having a community integration network, I think, is a very important and powerful one, and one that I personally would really like to see and even be and actually be part of on the North Coast. So there's kind of an idea that I'd like to get happening on the North Coast.
Community is all important. It's really that simple. It's what colours a trip. Psychedelics bring out what's in a person, but you also take in what's around you at the same time. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a whole discourse, anti-war, pro-environment, changing the world. So a lot of people that took acid or mushrooms or whatever at that point came away with that program and spent the rest of their lives trying to do it. That's not really so common these days, but it is in the right community. So if you take, if you take a mushroom trip in a room full of alt-righters, you're probably going to come down being a bit of a Nazi, But if you take it in a space with people who are looking out for everybody else and have a good ideology, and that's a subjective thing, a good ideology, as I perceive it. But I think that's really important. So that, to me, community.
Community shares knowledge. Community shares stories. Many of us probably found psychedelics or had psychedelics within our own little community. So it's like, here, try this. This is amazing. But the knowledge about that, and particularly like it's getting better now. I mean, we've had websites like Earwolf, for example, and groups like EGA and other groups, the Corroboree online, that communicate knowledge about substances, about plants, and so that we get an idea of what this thing is that we're participating in, what harms are associated with it, and what we expect from it. Community also forms the basis of a lot of plant sharing. Those of us here who grow cacti have probably, we've accessed those plants from within our community. Passing on plants, passing on knowledge. And I guess my final point is within certainly like the mycology community, a lot of the data that we get comes from within community. These are illegal plants as well, or illegal fungi. Trying to get some of the scientific data is really, really challenging. So you've got members of the community who are doing a little bit of the hard work to get like genetic information created, processed and shared. There's a lot of sharing of observational data like for mushrooms and where they grow and improving our understanding. That community network is really, really vital within psychedelics. And that's it.
I think the psychedelic community is at an interesting moment, and I definitely also think EGA is like the home of the Australian psychedelic scene, everything it has been for a long time. And so I think a lot of people that then, because they have a conference, right, that goes every second year, and every fourth year is the best one because it's a big outdoor event. And everyone that's into this weird plant stuff, which it features psychedelics very heavily, but it also other psychoactive plants, everyone gets together and like lots of cool people, kind of like here I guess, obscure people that know cool weird plant shit, and you learn things you wouldn't have learned in any other room, and someone brings a plant you've never seen before, and all this really cool stuff. But with psychedelics having this really big kind of moment in medicine that's also like spiraling out kind of into other business and other stuff, there's now this huge influx, like maybe you call it mainstreaming, right, or something like that. And I think cannabis has gone through that same moment, and I reckon probably Mardi Gras has had that same moment, right, where there's all the OGs that have been fighting this fight for however long, and now there's just all these random people that come from all over the place that have come for the first time and maybe only recently started using cannabis, and maybe they're values are a bit more mainstream or different or whatever, and then there's this kind of cultural clash, well, maybe not a cultural clash, but it's just like a change of what was going on, this influx of new people, and then all these kind of new conversations, and everyone's unsure about what the values are and where it all goes. So yeah, I think psychedelic culture is at that moment currently that maybe we've seen in cannabis happen to some degree already, and I don't know, I feel lots of things about it, good and bad. But the thing I've always loved about the community is this really niche, unique people with really cool, special things that I wouldn't have found or learned about anywhere else. And yeah, I really hope that sticks around and doesn't get diluted by people that are maybe just here for the fun and the noise and the excitement. Because, you know, that's still good too, we should all enjoy it. But yeah, I love the deep nerds. That's my favorite thing about the community.
Yeah, I mean, community does many things. One thing I will say is, like, when we've all decided to put ourselves on the line and take some substances that aren't legal, we often really share our experiences, and those experiences can formulate better models of dealing with things and helping each other out. So I guess you could understand when the police come across someone tripping, they have a very different model to a community-based model around crowd care. So I think like crowd care is a good example where everyone's talking to each other and trying to figure out the best way to make the person who's having a moderate or bad or a challenging experience better, and that's a very informed model that's come over time. And you know, obviously community, that's completely a community model as opposed to what would happen if the police come against someone. So the community does lots of things, but it outputs and shares knowledge to help the community in general, especially newcomers. So it's just one example I thought I'd give. Next question. Here we go. Directly from the ward.
Thanks for your time and your knowledge today. I'm particularly interested in the gentleman with the background in psychology, about his kind of ideas about the future of psychedelic assisted therapies, and also acknowledging Neil's ambivalence about these kinds of substances being brought into, you know, being pathologized or trying to fix people, and different perspectives on it. But there potentially are some clinical applications for these substances in conjunction with therapy, and I was wondering if you had any predictions or preferences about how they might be applied.
Thank you. Yeah, there is a huge amount of research going on now, which is great, I have to say. The system being what it is, I think there won't be sort of more widespread clinical use without the research. That's the reality. But the good news of that is that there's a whole range of both quote-unquote sort of disorders, problems that psychedelics being trialed for, and also that there's progressively a wider range of psychedelic medicines that are being trialed as well. So, you know, we started off with psilocybin and MDMA, and then there's sort of mainly in Switzerland and now New Zealand LSD research, but now there's DMT research happening, there's ibogaine research just starting, you know, so the mycologists here can probably tell a little more about the range of medicines that are being used, but suffice it to say, there is a huge amount of research going on. So obviously the leaders currently, the ones that are deregulated for clinical use here, are MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. I think probably the next cab off the rank is psilocybin-assisted therapy for people with terminal illnesses. I think there's a good chance that that will come through fairly soon. And, you know, we're basically then awaiting sort of other research to go from phase 1, phase 2, and then phase 3 trials are kind of the key ones. but a lot of things are at the phase 2 stage now, so kind of getting there. There's a sort of issue of the more that the there's a number of issues, to do with like the drug companies and their hold on and the profit motive and so forth, and what that's doing, and a whole range of issues which not enough time to go into now. But I think one of the things that the research is doing is it's kind of fueling, like, as you see more and more research coming out, there's more and more impatience, and very understandable impatience for that research to be now sort of transformed into actually clinical usage. And I think that's a real kind of sort of dynamic that's quite difficult in this space at the moment.
I'll return to a question about research at the very end, so I'm going to sort of probe us a little more on that one. But before then, do we have any other questions? Please, ask us anything.
Just have a question in regard to ibogaine. As far as addiction treatment, say alcohol and other things, but is microdosing effective? Is microdosing ibogaine effective against addiction, or to treat or help with addiction as much as a heavy dose?
Rachel's unfortunately not here, which would have been probably a primary question for her. But we'll go to Liam. You got the mic? He's got a mic.
Great point. I do have a mic. So I'll begin by echoing the same annoying thing we keep saying, and then make it slightly more interesting. But not enough research, right? But I have definitely come across anecdotal reports, because for people that don't know, a unique thing about ibogaine, which is the primary active chemical in iboga, which is a psychedelic plant from kind of primarily growing in Africa. So yeah, it's a psychedelic. We can kind of expect effects similar to psilocybin and mushrooms, like mescaline acid, like the other things we've been talking about. But the unique feature of this chemical is that people that have a dependency on opioids seem to be able to dose iboga and then withdraw from opioids without having all these other withdrawal symptoms that people normally have, that normally require tapering, and that can be quite difficult, experiencing shitty symptoms like throwing up, diarrhea, like mood stuff. Anyway, so withdrawing from opioids is quite difficult. And can you do it with microdosing though? Because macrodosing also, iboga, comes with an additional health risk, unlike other psychedelics. It can like fuck with the QR intervals of your heart. So really, you probably shouldn't be messing with it unless you have someone monitoring that knows how to respond if shit gets weird. Like I'm normally not so conservative with drugs, but this is like one that I emphasize this risk. And I have heard anecdotal reports of people with opioid dependency microdosing iboga. This specific example I know of someone who went through was with some iboga tincture. I have no idea of where, when, or the quality of this stuff. But they weren't getting a full-on dose, and they were afraid of a full-on dose, and they wanted to try to get off, I think they were on oxys or something like this, and they couldn't stop using it. And yeah, I think they used it every day for a week, and they just said they didn't have any withdrawal symptoms from. But this is just one instance of someone I've spoken to, but yeah, I definitely think it's something worth exploring, especially if it has reduced risk, right? Not everyone can get a nurse to monitor for them while they have this heavy trip.
I'm uncertain about the ibogaine microdosing. Again, I echo Liam. There's just not enough research on that particular topic, but it certainly sounds like something that would be an interesting thing to look into. Ibogaine is a highly problematic substance to take because it does fuck with your heart. But things, psilocybin and LSD have been shown to also be really, really good with addiction issues as well, helping to cure addiction. There was a bunch of research from the 60s that, it's been shown to help stop alcohol addiction, tobacco or nicotine addiction. I don't I'm not sure whether there's anything a bit more contemporary with respect to, say, opiates, but I don't see why it couldn't be used in that case as well.
Most of that research was with big doses, though.
Yeah, big doses.
I've got a mate who's old acid head tripper from the 60s and 70s. Then, as Robbie pointed out before, like many of them became a junkie in the 80s and 90s. And was a very bad heroin addict for a long time. Sometime in the 80s, we all discovered that there's a plant that grows up in North Queensland called the banana bush, which contains the same basic chemicals as ibogaine. So it wasn't very easy to get ibogaine in Australia at that point. So he spent years and years getting enough iboga, or enough banana bush, to do an extraction so he could clean himself up. And he'd always stop before he had enough to get a big whack, because it just does. And it never worked for him. So I think actually, as Kane said, in the 50s and 60s, they did research with sledgehammer doses of LSD on people that were alcoholics. And yeah, if they'd never had it before, it could change their whole world and they'd give up alcohol for quite a long time. As far as how long it lasted afterwards when they got back on it, that hasn't really been looked at. And I think possibly ibogaine's in the same category. It's interesting what he said about that actually has something that helps to get away from the actual physical addiction. So that's a plus. But I don't know, I think a lot of it's dependent on the big dose that you actually have to look at what's going on inside you. And that's probably only going to work if you've been tripped.
Yes, I just have something that's kind of left field. I suppose a lot of people here will know that just this week, Trump attempted to pronounce the word ibogaine in the Oval Office, and it sent a frisson, shiver down my spine. I'm not sure if what was worse, his articulation of this word and its implications, or his frequent use of the word nuclear. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Do we have any questions from the females in the audience? Be good to get.
I just want to say thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge as well. But my question was kind of personal. I was just wondering, what's your favorite psychedelic and why?
I answered this one pretty directly yesterday. My avatar is definitely interested in psilocybin. I'm not yet, haven't tried it, but my avatar's very keen and has had a long-term relationship that's led to 20 years of donating my life to a charity to try to support plants and psychedelics, but that was my avatar.
I mean, I'm sure that question could probably lead hours of discourse from these guys as well, but I'll just briefly say that I think Salvia divinorum is always the plant that I return to as the most grounding. I mean, if in the right context and dosage, I find that I'm in a place of smoking jaw-dropping laughter to the point where I'm probably where my neighbour is is probably freaking out. I mean, I won't go into much detail, but I think Salvia at 5 times is an extraordinary contact spirit, and I think that I haven't been there anywhere near enough, and I think that at least once a year, I think it's important to reunite myself with Salvia and with the jaw-dropping laughter that it inspires.
I think I'm just going to answer that question as a clinician. I have been a therapist on a clinical trial for people with prolonged grief from losing partners or children to cancer, and I have to say that psilocybin assisted therapy for prolonged grief was stunning. So there were people who had prolonged grief for like 7 years. It really just completely messed up their lives. And what I witnessed was just like radical change over the next 2 or 3 months. So kind of getting their lives completely back on track. I get very happy to talk with you after this session.
LSD out of a sort of perverse loyalty and nostalgia, because it was my first psychedelic that I ever had, and it blew my mind and changed my life, definitely for the better. But I'd say also DMT, because of its brevity. When I first stumbled on that in the 70s, it was like, holy fuck, I can have a life-changing experience, come down in 15 minutes and still make dinner for the kids. Cool.
I'd have to say psilocybin was mine. I'm not sure whether I found it or you found me. That was a particularly weird circumstance. And, it was incredibly profound. Kind of like life-changing, profound. And the thing that came out of it for me was just like, this experience needs to be examined, and it needs to be followed, and it needs to be shared and communicated. It's profound. It will change your life. Hopefully, mostly for the better. I know some people have struggled with psilocybin experiences. For me, it was radically life-altering, and today it's just like, it was just the thing I come back to, and it's like, that's amazing, and I really hope everybody else gets to experience that and gets to have that perspective on their life and their mortality, and finding meaning in who they are and where they're going and what they're doing. I'm also going to echo Graham on this one. Salvia is a counterpoint to that. It's the fucking weirdest, bizarrest thing. And I like to come back to it every now and then, because I don't know why and what is going on there, but I don't think there's necessarily very much meaning in it, but it takes you apart. It shows you something else about reality and the nature of understanding, and does take a little while to piece yourself back together. But, I also recommend a high degree of caution. I know people have had some pretty horrible experiences on it, so go low, go slow.
I don't really like picking favorites, and I don't like, in my own mind, I try not to create better or worse, especially when I think about that attitude in itself is going to influence the experience, right? I don't want to bias myself to liking or disliking a chemical, but in the interest of trying to think of what have we suggested and what other flavors might I recommend, not that I'm recommending or doing anything criminal, but I think a useful tool for the stash bag is 2CB, especially in aqueous nasal formulation. It makes it a lot easier to dose. It's very short lasting, very colourful. It's like a great, if we're talking strictly 5-HT2A agonists, I suggest this one is a good one. Very colourful, not too stressful, great party tool. So 2CB is good stuff. But in terms of personal novelty, a flavour of the present, for me is acacia tryptamines. My boss actually let the cat out of the bag, so I'm allowed to say it now, but there's definitely mystery tryptamine peaks in active acacia that don't have enough DMT to get you high. And this high is certainly very interesting and psychedelic, I believe. So yeah, that's something else. That's a current favourite if I must start fighting amongst the children. Yeah.
Another question? So we're into overtime here, and until everyone leaves, we'll keep going for a few minutes. So thanks for sticking around.
So I am very naive. I have very little experience. A lot of the names and letter combinations that you're putting together, I don't understand at all. What's the difference between all the different psychedelics?
Two primary groups, if we're talking chemical structures. tryptamines and phenethylamines. You can tell by the name they're already very similar. The best way to conceptualize this simply is think of them maybe like they're keys that open a particular lock in your body. And that lock in your body relative to psychedelics is primarily one called 5-HT2A, which is a serotonin subreceptor, because there are a bunch of different serotonin receptors. We think that psychedelics primarily get activity from operating on this one. And so phenethylamines and tryptamines are the two type of keys that fit in this lock. And just to give you examples of different types of drugs in these psychedelic groups, we've got mescaline, the stuff in cactus, in the phenethylamine category. And we've got psilocybin or DMT, psilocybin in mushrooms, DMT in acacia trees, in the tryptamine group. In terms of trying to distinguish them in terms of their qualitative effects and say, oh, this one's more like this one's more like that, I generally wouldn't lean into that, but if I must, let's say I think tryptamines, I reckon that's what someone's taken if they told me they saw a UFO. And phenethylamines, I think they're less, even if you see stuff, it's more like color enhancement and less like fractal geometry, just to make a broad generalization.
And then on top of that, you've got salvia, which comes from Salvia divinorum, which is a kappa opioid agonist, which is a different group of receptors altogether.
Different lock. Different lock.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether we have a firm understanding of how that actually works though.
We don't in general, but I exclude it from psychedelic category because it works on a different lock, just for my kind of OCD about categories. I think the effects are qualitatively very different to what I think of psychedelic. I think salvia is closer towards maybe what I describe as dissociative. But getting into what is psychedelic, what that means is that it then becomes like super murky, much as it does with psychoactive in general. And like, am I high if I meditate? You know, if I breathe just right, like is chili getting me high? It becomes all a bit like, whoa.
Anyone else want to add anything there? I'll also mention MDMA, which is not actually technically a psychedelic, but I think since it's probably the most often poly drug used.
But then that is a phenethylamine.
Yeah.
Same.
Works
partially on 5-HT2A, but mostly on another serotonin subreceptor. But people are of this category because serotonin agonism is highly complex.
And definitely since polymorphic drug use is most often done with MDMA and a psychedelic, definitely worth mentioning, but as you say, it's technically a psychedelic.
When these categories are created by people who group things, and often groups are teaching tools or learning tools rather than actually being relevant to science, often the categories kind of collapse the deeper you get into it. You're like, actually everything is an individual, nothing's in a group. When you group them, it's like forcing things to fit. So basically, everything you learn, eventually you unlearn. When you're a big scientist, you're like, oh, I don't know shit. That's basically what you learn in science.
All right. Anyone else got a question here? Okay. What was that?
Free samples.
Samples? Talk to your doctor. All right, I'm just going to probably ask a final kind of question. Again, pretty loaded. What do people think about the future of psychedelics in Australia? I guess we've got very big contrast with, I guess in the 50s, all psychedelics were legal. Whether you knew about them or used them, they were pretty much legal. And then in 1965 and around then, they started to really push psychedelics into, a different category where it could only be in research. And then around the 80s, or just before the 80s, they shut that down for a large degree, so it couldn't be used in research. If they didn't shut it down, the appetite wasn't there. And then I guess you've got two distinct areas. You've got the underground, which has continued to use psychedelics unbroken for all time. You know, that's pretty obvious. The underground and the cultural use has existed forever. And then I guess in the last, you had about a flurry of research between 1950 and 1960s and 70s until it got shut down. And then you've got this, for people in the psychedelic scene, it's often a negative term, the psychedelic renaissance. I think for newcomers, it's good because it helps them understand, okay, psychedelic renaissance, we're getting there, something's coming up. Okay, something's happening again around psychedelics, but it's actually quite a negative term for many insiders. But you've got a resurgence in psychedelic research in Australia, and obviously now we've got medicines, psychedelics being made into medicines in Australia and around the world. That is going to be a trend, I think. But my question is, what are some of the pros and cons, and how do you see the future of psychedelics in Australia? For the underground, some of the pros, the cons, and for the research side and I guess the medicalised side, you don't have to answer everything, but if you could just give a comment to that and the future in this country. And I'll just say, like, it's barely been mentioned, but I think many of us here, it's like obvious. The reform around decriminalisation and the move to push decriminalisation and free the laws around drugs. The psychedelics is clearly like probably going to be the most powerful thing to happen around psychedelics. But you know, that's a whole nother thing that we're all here for, right? But let's focus on underground and above ground psychedelic research and the future or hopes for Australia.
Yeah, that is a good question, and I'm sure that my fellow panelists would have a lot to say on that, because they've been deeply involved in these processes. I mean, I've been outside of the country for quite some time, and I've focused, as you know, on a biography of Terence, and so that's a sort of a large body of knowledge, but really compacted into, well, down into a 500-page book. And but it is interesting that Terence did come to Australia, and he did come to this region for about 10 days in 1997. And I also have a chapter about that experience where the reader gets into the back seat of Terence in his tour of Australia in the latest edition of EGA Journal. Thank you, Ronnie. And during that trip, he just on Salvia, he was, you know, obviously he was a guy who was you know, hammering away through the dark ages of the war on drugs as a you know, a cognitive libertarian, and he was quite through the mid-90s quite a vocal proponent of salvia, and really exposed salvia to a lot of people in this country during that trip, and in doing so, you know, demonstrated his quite opposed view to his then ex-wife, Kat Harrison, who subsequently toured Australia, who had various different views on salvia, whereas Terence regarded this plant as a sort of an empty compound that we can occupy. Kat Harrison has understood its complex colonial history, and it was intriguing to me that 5 years after Terence's appearance in Australia, Australia became the first country to prohibit salvia, and I suspect that he did have federal police in the audience, and were watching very closely, and so we can be quite ambivalent about Terence's role there, and yeah, that's all I'll have to say. I'll pass it on to you.
Decriminalisation, number one. Number two, at the moment, to have psychedelic assisted therapy in Australia, if you're not in a clinical trial, will cost you between $20,000 and $30,000, and that is clearly absurd. It's particularly absurd because probably the people who most need psychedelic assisted therapy are those who have mental health problems and are probably in the least position to actually afford it. So something needs to radically change there, and obviously that then involves the government, you know, really taking on board the value of psychedelic assisted therapy and supporting it. I'll stop at that.
As I said earlier, I'm a bit horrified by what I've seen happening with cannabis and also what seems to be happening with psychedelics. I'd also like to say I absolutely and totally respect the work that these three gentlemen have done and are continuing to do, because we do need to know what this shit does and how it works. But it'd be so good if we could just have decriminalisation instead of legalisation, but unfortunately that horse has run off. Because as soon as it's legalised, the corporations come in and take it over and turn it into a business. And it was a business before, sure, but it was a business with a bit more heart, and it was an affordable business. And I just think, I don't know, it's not going to happen. I'll repeat what I said last year. With a bit of luck, with the collapse of the American empire, with global warming, climate change, and with just the general shit fight we're looking at globally at the moment, it's all going to just dissipate and they'll go away and we won't have to worry about them. But I don't know if that's going to happen. Doesn't matter, I'll be dead soon.
I'm a big advocate of decriminalisation as well. I'm not in favour of legalisation. I think, you know, it does cause problems. It's just like, you know, it brings corporations in on this, and I prefer community. I prefer this kind of community where we can all share these substances and talk about them as a group. Yeah, I see the benefits of the therapeutic use. You know, like my own experiences is like I find it very, very helpful in my life. There's other aspects of research too, though. There's studying these compounds does require a lot of really complicated paperwork. You know, like these are Schedule 9 substances. I think probably for the time being, I know some people kind of have exceptions to this, but you know, there's some really fascinating stuff going on in the underground. There are people who are taking this on board and running with it and just going ahead regardless of the legalities of it. And these people are doing great work and really contributing to the community in terms of understanding. I can certainly speak to the mushroom side of things in understanding what species are present, the ecology around these species, how to cultivate them. There are opportunities to get these things tested to understand potency, etc., etc. A lot of this comes from the underground, and has been for a long, long time. And you know, if you start to bring in legalisation into this situation, it makes it harder then for some of these things to be done. I think I prefer the status quo as is for the time being, until we kind of get our head around how the corporate situation is going to work with psychedelics. Yeah, I prefer decriminalisation.
I think I share the sentiment that we're in like a late stage capitalist nightmare and the earth is on fire and like we're all fucked. Like that definitely, I see that and I agree. But I guess my reaction is different to some and many in the psychedelic community. It's like, you know, all these big players are coming in, it's becoming corporatized, it's like, shit, it's dog eat dog. But, you know, to be honest, I'm fucking sick of dogs trying to eat me and I'm going to eat some fucking dog. It's, you know, I'm sorry that that's the way it's going to be, but for me, having a large, empowered institution in this space come at me with lawyers was enough to make me be like, actually, no, I need to not rely on anyone else. I need to get my own shit. It's okay for me to get power and sell plants if I must at an exorbitant price to, you know, grow this thing that I want to grow. Because if our community, not just me, if we all don't take ownership and value over what is our knowledge and our plants and our stuff that we've been growing and building, someone is just going to come in and take it. And I think playing the corporate game is not something that I want to do or I like, but I think if we want to like hold some ownership over, you know, our community and our IP essentially, I think we need to play the game, or at least that's the position I'm currently trying to play, because I don't want some shitty organisation that knows nothing about my plants come in and have beef with me. Like, I want to be able to stand up and say, no, fuck you, this is our thing, this is how it should be, and I disagree with you, and I shouldn't just have, because you have more money than me, I have to be afraid of you, that you might just attack me with lawyers and because you don't like me. Like, we need to be able to stand on that footing, and sadly, I think we need to become corporate dogs to like figure that shit out. I don't love it, but that's how I feel about it. Yeah, and I also, there is conflict within me over this, so, you know, sorry for selling out.
I'd like to make a couple of acknowledgements. So obviously I'd like to thank all the First Nations people. Unfortunately, most of these plant substances or the derivatives have been extracted from their cultures, and often their culture has been wiped out completely. Where possible, we really need to give back to these communities and support these communities. And it's not just about throwing money, it's about slowing down and trying to understand best practice for them, not for us. So I just want to acknowledge First Nations people, and where possibly, please support First Nations people on this journey. And they have had an unbroken, in some ways, unbroken relationships where they exist. There are some, and they can really help and teach us. So my second acknowledgement is to all of the amazing females in the audience and at this festival. In my experience, yes, I'm a male, but I have worked in a charity for 22 years, and it has been the power and dedication of all the amazing females who make it happen. So that's my acknowledgement. Thank you. And then, yeah, just want to thank all of our panelists and all of our audience for such amazing questions. Thank you.